So welcome to the Iowa.net user group meeting. We do this usually once a month. This week we've got Dave Rooney, or this month I should say. Dave Rooney is going to be talking about no big processes. I'll let Dave introduce himself a little bit, but I know Dave is kind of a seasoned software craftsperson, a lot of experience in building software and definitely learning or leaning on some of the best practices that we've learned, which might not be a lot of upfront planning in some traditional models, but he's found some ways to be very effective in the way that he delivers software and also building up others to make sure that those teams get stronger as well. So we're going to be talking about no big processes. We know that there are still companies out there that want to have estimates and do as much upfront planning as it can. And I think that Dave has found that there are better ways for teams to work so they can focus more on the customer problems and getting solutions delivered to them quickly, effectively and then efficiently. This meeting sponsor, we are recording it. We will put it out on YouTube. Our meeting sponsor this week is Robert Half Technologies. Do we have anybody from Robert Half here who would like to introduce themselves and or the company? Pause for that for a moment here. Sometimes their sponsors show up, sometimes they don't. But the one thing is the sponsors have always been there for us and have really helped out with the .NET user group going on 20 years now, trying to build our community and making sure that we're bringing relevant content to our developers and also bringing that network and that community to the teams as well. So with that, I will hand it over to Dave. He'll talk for about 15 minutes and then we'll have our JetBrains drawing afterwards. And I don't know if there's anything else, so I'll throw it to you, Dave.
All right. Thanks, Dustin. Appreciate it. So I have been around doing this software thing since the 80s. Wrote my first line of code in 1981, and it wasn't Hello World. It was 10 print hello, 20 go to 10, and in BASIC. As Justin says, software developer. I still write code, still like to play around in it. I use test-driven development and all that from extreme programming and those approaches. I've been a manager a few times. I've been an agile coach since 2006, and a mix between actual product development and consulting coaching. So I'd like to say that I have been able to eat my own dog food a few times, and sometimes it's tasty, sometimes not so much. What I'm saying here with no big processes, and originally this was called no processes, but somebody said maybe you should just call it no big processes, and I did. Um, you might have heard of the no estimates movement or the no projects movement, and those don't really mean no estimates at all or no projects at all, but rather they question the prevailing approaches to those. And that's what I'm doing here with big processes. I want to question the prevailing notions, the prevailing ideas, prevailing wisdom about processes. So what is a process anyway? It's, again, a series of actions or steps taken in order to achieve a particular end. And that's pretty straightforward. We used a process here when we started out the session, and where there's an introduction, talk about the sponsors, word was escaping me, and then we get into the presentation. It's going to go a certain length of time, and afterwards, question and answer, and those sorts of things. That's a process, and we have them everywhere. We have them all over the place. So, what is it that we need them for? So, I'm going to put this out to the group, and you can use the chat, or if you want to come off mute and say it. Why would you use a process? What are the reasons that you can think of for having a process?
Predictability, reducing cognitive load.
Sure. Consistency, transparency, I see. Yeah. Anything else?
Make it clear who to blame when things go wrong.
Yeah, there's a term called blame storming, which is where you have a efficiency. Thank you. Yep. Where you have a meeting afterwards to figure out who all to blame. Okay, thank you. Those are all good reasons. Now, I'm sure everybody has seen this, the Agile Manifesto. But do you know why it was created? Anybody know why the Agile Manifesto was created in 2001? And again, you can come off mute if you like. All right, we'll go ahead. Well, as early as 1968, there was this definition. People identified what they called the software crisis in the software industry. And even in 1968, the pace at which computing power and capabilities were improving was far ahead of far ahead of what software developers could match. Um, products were routinely over budget, late, or outright failures, and they're increasing efforts to figure out how to fix these problems. Well, what was the response? Well, back then, it was more prescription, more rigor, more control, more everything. If you failed, then you just didn't use the process well enough. You got to use the process harder. But failure was still widespread. This was starting to happen when I came into the industry in the mid 80s and as a student, and then late 80s full time. You still saw failures, but it was all process, process, process. The successes that we saw, a lot of them shared the characteristics of applying the opposite of these heavy processes. Uh, if anybody here is old enough to remember rapid application development, I'm having difficulty talking today. It became popular in the very early 90s. James Martin was behind that. And it was one lightweight approach that favored fast and early feedback. And that may sound familiar to those of us who have been through the agile world. Other lightweight methods emerged with that common goal to counter the large heavyweight processes. And these will be familiar: extreme programming, Scrum, feature driven development, adaptive software development from Jim Highsmith, DSDM, which was very popular in the UK and Europe, and the Crystal Series methods from Alistair Coburn. And of course, the Agile Manifesto was created by representatives from each of these lightweight methods when they got together at a ski resort in Utah, and they determined how they could work together to improve the world of software development. So in the end, Agile approaches were the response to the response, not the response to the crisis itself. They were the response to the heavyweight methods that formed the original response to the software crisis. So why is this important to know? Because there are some processes that are quite popular these days that you may see. Here's one. It's SAFe, the Scaled Agile Framework. There is very little that's remotely agile about the process, except a word in its name. I like to say it's unsafe at any scale, with a nod to Ralph Nader. For example, if you need an engineer to feed the process, then you've probably lost the plot when it comes to agility. And it's not a coincidence that the main person behind SAFe was also very, very big in the rationally unified process, or RUP world, but that's a different story to come later. Here's another one. This is called LESS, even though there's more. Large Scale Scrum by Craig Larman and Bas Voda. I actually worked with Craig Larman in LESS back in 2010, 2012 at a large telecom customer. And Craig is the first one to say that you don't even want to touch this unless you have 5 teams or more. And he was using it originally with very, very large uh, groups up to 2,000 people working on the same product. This isn't something you just throw into an organization because you have a few teams. You really need to understand when it's applicable, because it has so much overhead associated with it, and it still becomes large and heavy. Here's another one, Nexus, which came from one of the originators of Scrum, Ken Schwaber. It's another scaling process that adds weight and complexity to how you deliver products. Um, and again, it's something that you don't need to use until you get to the point where you have so many teams working on the same product that you need to identify how to work together in that. Then there's this monstrosity that came out from our good friends at Deloitte, which should scare us all into retreating into a cave in the Himalayas and contemplating our life choices. What's happened in the past 10, 12, 14 years is that Agile as we know it today has become the adversary it was created to counteract. It was originally created as a way to respond to the response to the software crisis. And now we see Agile itself as a response needs to be counteracted. So what do we do now? Well, let's start with this pesky thing that teams are made up of, people. And I'm not going to read through this whole thing here. I'll make sure the slides are available after, and the recording you can look at again. But Alistair Coburn, one of the signatories or authors of the Agile Manifesto, talked about how in his research that he noticed that people were a nonlinear first order component in software development, which he also described, it might have been in this paper or somewhere else, but he did describe that as a flash of the blindingly obvious to him. That, of course, we should know that, but it's something that we don't talk about a whole lot, is that people, as he says, are nonlinear. Has anybody here ever had a really great day where they were really, really productive and then went home, and if they have young kids or something like that, didn't get a good sleep, and the next day you're a bag of toys and can barely function? Yeah, everybody has been through that sort of thing where that sort of consistency just doesn't exist with human beings. Uh, you can be consistent for a while, but everyone's going to have a bad day, and teams are going to have bad days or bad weeks. But it's all about ensuring that we understand how people affect this, and not it's their resources is the word that comes to mind. That I despise the use of the word resource when it comes to people, because that's making an assumption that every single human being is exactly the same. You take Dustin out of the team and put Dave in, and suddenly I'm just the same as Dustin. Well, I'm not. I don't have the context. I may be a terrible programmer compared to Dustin, or potentially the opposite. Dustin was terrible and I'm really good. It just depends on the human being. And of course, teams are made of people. Soylent Green in 1973 was actually quite prescient about where we would end up today. You got to tell them teams are made of people. So have a look at this monstrosity again. Where's the customer? Where are the people? There's very little there. And when it comes to understanding and looking at processes that we see today, even down to Scrum for an individual team, anybody who here who's watched Star Trek Discovery, in the very first season, we had Gabriel Lorca, and he was eventually outed as a villain. But I love this quote from him: "Universal laws for lackeys, context is for kings." And that's where he pulled Michael Burnham out from being sent away to prison for the rest of her life to actually working with them. Now, he had an ulterior motive, but still, this is a great quote, and something that we should take with us, that context is so important. So what if we started with no process at all? Not even the original lightweight processes, not even XP, Scrum, any of those. We started with nothing. We sandblasted and stripped away everything and started over to create a process that worked for us rather than we have to work for the process. How could we do that? Well, ultimately, there are only two key activities required to deliver software systems successfully. First, we need to ship something. And for a variety of reasons here, feedback is the most important aspect of delivering software. And this is why we talk about delivering early and often in a lot of processes, such as extreme programming. We want to make sure that we can get something out and get feedback as quickly as possible. And this is where continuous delivery really shines, is that you can get that something out into the customer's hands as quickly as you possibly can. I've worked in this mode and it's incredible. You can get feedback, you can do A/B tests, you can do all of these things, and you can pivot very, very quickly when you need to. Rule number one is Kubernetes. After shipping, we need to reflect honestly on how we work together. How did I work individually, how we work together as a team, and how we work with our stakeholders to improve, and customers, if stakeholders and customers are different, to improve how we work the next time we ship. Repeat this cycle indefinitely, and you're constantly seeking to incrementally improve. We may know that as a retrospective, of course, uh, but think of it as just internal feedback within the team, taking all the inputs from how they worked, getting inputs from the people, getting inputs from outside the team, and saying, okay, for our next piece that we ship, what can we do differently, or what experiments could we try in order to improve? And you want to keep doing this. A lot of groups that I've coached will go through the motions of a retrospective. What went well? What needs improvement? What are the actions that nobody ever really gets around to, or gets around to one or maybe two? But that reflection is so critical in how you improve, that we need to constantly be doing it. Now, it doesn't mean you have to do it every sprint. You could do it every day. You could take time at the end of the day to have a real quick wrap up. What did we do today? What can we do better tomorrow? Or how can we do this better tomorrow? You can do it on a completely as needed basis. That if the team figures, no, we're doing okay. We don't need to do this until we see a problem. And I know of teams that have done that, where they wouldn't have a retrospective for 3 months, and they'd have two in a week. And it was just an on-demand thing. If any one person decided they needed a retrospective, the team would do it. You can follow the scientific method here. How will you know that an experiment or change is effective? It's done something better. Form a hypothesis, devise an experiment to validate or invalidate the hypothesis, run the experiment for a meaningful period of time, and check the results. Did it validate the hypothesis or invalidate it? And if it's not clear which happened, then you probably need to adjust the experiment to make it more binary. What sort of things are you looking at here? Some measure of quality. Will it make your customers happy? Will it make the team happy? And those sorts of things actually make a difference. Happy people tend to be more productive. And if both the customers and the team are happy, a lot of good things must be happening there, because the customers are getting the value they feel they need. And if the team's happy, that means they're happy with the way things are working. And that's nothing but good. One of the key metrics I've always talked about is the happiness of the product owner or product manager. If a product owner or product manager is really happy, a lot of that stuff has to be in place. The stakeholders are happy, customers are happy, teams happy. They're getting value as at a good rate. It's not overwhelming anybody. That's a good sign if they're happy. It's not something you're going to pull out of Jira, obviously, but that's a whole other presentation. So Brian Merrick, one of the authors of the Agile Manifesto, back when that community, I was part of it in the early 2000s, people were talking lots and lots of theory. And he would always stick into these conversations with an example would be handy about now. And that comes up to me every time, or that saying comes to me every time that we get too much in the theoretical. So let's look at some actual cases of where we did this. Here's a classic one. The whole genesis of extreme programming itself was Kent Beck was advised by the CIO of Chrysler that Kent advised the CIO of Chrysler that a complete rewrite was needed for the C3 Chrysler Comprehensive Compensation Program. He was told that he'd have to lead the team if they're going to do a full rewrite, and So what he did was reflected on his career to that point and what had worked well for him before in his career. And as the saying goes, from Spinal Tap, turned the dials up to 11 and all those practices. Now, that started in 1996. And he actually termed it extreme programming when the team, the C3 team, first started using it in 1996. And they adjusted it significantly between 96 and 1999 when he wrote the original book, Extreme Programming Explained. And it continued to evolve and still exists today in a similarly evolved form. Another one is Shopify. Not Spotify, but Shopify, the for creating online stores. I worked there from 2012 to 2014. It started in 2003 with three guys working in a coffee shop. Um, their guiding principles then were GSD, get stuff done, and don't solve problems we don't already have. When I left in 2014, there were 22 development teams, and no two were using the exact same process. And that was a strength, not a weakness. There were common practices and philosophy across the organization, and they relied much more on communication and collaboration instead of a formal process. They weren't perfect by any stretch of the imagination, but they eventually scaled out. They did have to add more processes or more facets of process as they got bigger. When I started in 2012, there were 110 people. When I left in 2014, they had broken 500. Right now, even after layoffs, there are over 5,000. In their last quarter, they reported $2 billion in revenue. They were when I was with them, they weren't reporting revenue; they were reporting total sales by their merchants to sound better. But now they're a powerhouse in that industry. Another company that I worked at originally called UITV. They have since been acquired by Warner Media, and they started as creating more game-like or more rich user interfaces for different things, and found a niche in the video streaming for platforms. You think of Netflix, and they actually did a reskin of Netflix to try to sell back to Netflix. It didn't work. But they were on all sorts of different platforms. You think of all the game consoles, on tablets, on phones, all of these different things. And they had an SDK that had a common code base for all of them written in C++. And along came Roku. And Roku wouldn't for a lot of reasons, wouldn't let us put C++ code on their device. Roku was very, very, very strict about security, and I think they had one incident, and it was patched in 8 hours, and an update went out, and that's since about 2010. The other thing with Roku is that their devices were very, very low end compared to other things, and we figured out in sort of a skunkworks way of doing things. We figured out there's a way I think we can do this where we could leverage both, and writing some native Roku stuff, and it talked over the wire to the C++ app, and it would send scenes and that sort of thing. And it was experimental. Even Roku was doubtful that, because we were working with them on this, they were doubtful that it would work. And I remember being asked for an estimate on how long it was going to take to deliver this, and I said I have no idea, because we were still in the if mode, not the when mode. We didn't know if this would work, and that was interesting to give an interesting discussion to have with project managers. But what I did with them was said, okay, let's be ridiculously transparent. We're going to do 2 demos a week. And you can come to our stand-ups. You can look at we were using Trello, our Trello board anytime you want. It gave the whole company access to it. And we were just, come see what's happening. And very quickly, the doubts went away. It was collaborate, collaborate, collaborate. Yes, we had a stand-up every day, but we were constantly talking. This was pre-COVID. And after we shipped the first app, which was kind of going back and forth with the customer of what do you need next, and we were successful. It worked. And after that, the work became much more predictable and we could apply more process. But before that, it was experiment, experiment, experiment. And once we got to the point of knowing how the experiments resulted and tweaking things on both on the device itself and in our backend platform, we were able to handle. If anybody here is an NCAA basketball fan, this would have been 2017, 2018, early 2018, whichever at the March Madness. There was a Cinderella team, Loyola wasn't Loyola itself, Loyola Marymount. I can't remember exactly now. It's lost in time. But they were a Cinderella team and got to the Sweet 16 or something like that. And one of their games was on a station that was going to be played on this. And we went from saying, yeah, I think we can, this is going to handle 1,000 concurrent sessions to when that game was on, it peaked at 12,000. And we didn't even, we did some things. We made sure it was set up, ready to go, but it handled it without even breaking a sweat. And that was all based on going through very, very, very quick repeated cycles of let's try this. We think it's going to end up with this. And that was how we got to the point that we could actually ship that. So this is great. These are great examples from me. But where do you start? What is it that you need to do to be able to get through this? Well, one is learning from the past. The original manifesto was pretty good. There are the values, which are kind of mom and apple pie of, well, of course, individuals and interactions, of course this, of course that. But the principles behind the manifesto, which were written slightly after, are just as important, if not more important, in a lot of cases because they're more concrete. You can look at them and understand how people would want to do some of these things. And the very first principle, our highest priority is to satisfy the customer through early and continuous delivery of valuable software. That right there is the key to what we've just talked about. Ship and get feedback and reflect. We want to ship something to them and we want to do it continuously so that we can get feedback. Now we've looked at the past, let's get with the times and some of these different ways of doing things today. Modern Agile, which would be familiar to Dustin, it's a refinement of the manifesto's original values from 2001, incorporating 20 years of real world experience. And really there, you're focusing on creating the environment for allowing agility to occur naturally. And you see there, deliver value continuously, again, make people awesome. And that could be on your team, it could be customers. Experiment and learn rapidly. Sounds familiar again, doesn't it? And make safety a prerequisite. Now, that means it's safe to do experiments. It means if you're the software itself will make it easier for people to do the right thing. And if they do the wrong thing in the software, it responds accordingly. The book Accelerate, which many might have heard of, it digs into DevOps and continuous delivery and provides real world data supporting the mindset and practices behind them by Nicole Forsgren. I highly recommend it. It's a lot of what we would think comes naturally from agile ways of working, again, taken to the extreme of continuous delivery. Team topologies examines how to look at teams behind the old, beyond the tired old 7 plus or minus 2 or 2 pizza teams, and how to structure teams to be most effective, especially when you have multiple teams involved. The 7 plus or minus 2 is an interesting one. At one point in time, I believe that was actually in the Scrum guide of 7 plus or minus 2 people per team. But the 7 plus or minus 2 comes from an interesting place. The origin of that number isn't what's the most effective team. It was when people were on a team, what team size did they have, provided them with the most satisfaction? And 7 plus or minus 2, so 5 to 9 was what came out. Now, satisfaction is good. And like I said, happy people are productive, but it might not necessarily be the most effective. I've worked on an XP team with 20 people, and it was very effective, and we did fine. That was a while ago. Would I recommend going to 20 people from the start? Not necessarily. But I also wouldn't tell a group that if there were already 20 people, no, you got to cut the team down. You got to make the team smaller. And finally, the one in the middle there, FAST, fluid scaling technology for agile. It's an emerging set of practices for dynamic scaling while maintaining agility. They follow this practice or approach called dynamic reteaming within a group of up to 50 people. That when you're working on one product, so you may not necessarily have static teams within that set of 50 people. You are reteaming on the fly when necessary for specific types of work, possibly. And of course, be principled. Go through the principles of the Agile Manifesto. The fifth principle: build projects around motivated individuals. Give them the support they need, and then get out of the way and let them go. Trust them to get the job done. And then self-organization. Best architectures, requirements, and designs emerge from self-organizing teams. Then there's this thing again: safe. How does this support an environment of trust and self-organization? Teams are very specific. Teams are very specifically created. They are not supposed to self-organize. The structure of teams is set. There's even to the point where developers in SAFE have a story point budget. They are supposed to deliver 8 story points per sprint. Well, again, that's a whole other talk that could be done. And if each team is expected to use the exact same approach, how do they inspect and adapt? How do they reflect to what works best for them? That's a key aspect of Scrum, the key aspect of Scrum. And yet using some of these bigger processes is totally against that. Going back again to Alistair Cockburn, people have a nonlinear first order effect. And by nonlinear, what he means is that if you put the right people together, it's certainly better than the sum of the parts. And the opposite to that is if you have somebody who really disrupts a team, it can have a nonlinear effect of taking the team down and really hurting effectiveness and productivity. And removing that person can have a nonlinear effect the opposite direction. We joke one time talking about somebody who went on vacation and a team's velocity, for lack of a better measure, actually improved while the person was on vacation. And of course, that person volunteered to remain on vacation for the rest of their life, but it didn't quite work that way. Don't forget that teams are made of people. Or if you remember Soylent Green, people. I love this quote from Esther Derby. And for those who don't know Esther, she was a co-author of the original Agile Retrospectives book and the second edition, which just came out. And pretty much anything that comes out of Esther is worth reading. A lot of great information on how to manage and how to work together. But this one here, when as a coach, quite often you hear, my people aren't motivated. How can I motivate them? Well, you don't actually motivate people. You can only create the conditions under which they'll be motivated. And rule 0 for that is don't do things or stop doing things that demotivate them. More meetings, that's going to demotivate people. Does anybody here love meetings? No hands? Okay. It's not the end of the world to have meetings. We do need to talk at times, but don't mistake meetings for collaboration. Collaboration can happen in meetings. Sometimes meetings are important to disseminate information, but the collaboration happens in a lot of different ways, not just in meetings. So you've got this. Leverage your prior experience. What have you done before that's worked really well? Consider that. If you're stripping away down to nothing and you're starting to add in to be able to deliver software, to be able to reflect and improve from there, we've all done things that have worked well. And working directly with a customer and getting feedback right away, I did that not knowing it was a good thing. I just seemed to make sense on the very first program I wrote for someone else, which was my basketball coach in high school. And I wrote a stats tracking app for him. And because I didn't know any better, I'd write a little bit, show it to him, get some feedback, make any changes, write the next little bit, show it to him, get feedback, with the notion of I want to get something that works for him as quickly as possible. And little did I know that I was agile in 1982, uh, rather than using a defined process. When I got to university, I found out I was doing it all wrong, and should be doing using other ways of doing this. But experiment with things that work and determine what works for your group. And what works for one team might not work for the team that sits right beside them. Because can anybody tell me why that might be? Go back to Soylent Green. People, different people. And that's something we have to take into consideration. Inspecting and adapting. I'm sometimes a critic of Scrum, but inspecting and adapting is a good thing. Now, that comes with all sorts of other processes as well. But most people encounter Scrum first as an agile process, so I'll use that terminology. But that's the key to success. And the last bullet point on there talking about challenging any and all assumptions. Things like, oh, sprints must be 2 weeks. Why? Why do you need sprints? Why do they have to be 2 weeks? I've worked in 1 week sprints several times, and I found that actually much more effective than 2 week sprints. I worked in 4 week sprints, I think, on the very first iterations, the very first XP project, very first time we applied XP. And that worked okay, but we could have gone a lot smaller than that. Uh, but one week actually, things that you can get away with in 2 week sprints, you can't get away with in 1 week sprints. When you say to somebody, let's go to 1 week sprint, they go, we can't do that because we've got this, that, and the other thing. I said, okay, how do we make those problems go away or much smaller? A lot of times it's automation, but that's a whole different thing. But but challenge those assumptions. Um, I can't come up with any more off the top of my head, but first of all, identify that something is an assumption. We're just going by the book. Well, why do you need to go by the book? That's an assumption right there. So let's hear from the group here. Again, you can challenge because they're builder and motivated individuals. Yes. Use the chat, or again, please come off mute and let me know what's worked well for you. Think of individual, like small bits of whether it's process or practices within the process that you have done that have worked well for you. Anybody?
I'll go ahead and jump in there, Dave.
Sure.
Um, I was just kind of reflecting on a lot of the things that you mentioned, and I think I've kind of come to some of a lot of the exact same conclusions. And having been on some great teams, I was on a team with Tyler with one client, which actually they were the prototype for what turned into SAFe. And as the team started to really embrace things, we had a lot of motivated individuals, and we were extremely high performing. It was challenging because all of us were um, really challenged to kind of keep finding better ways of doing things. It wasn't easy to just blindly follow the process, which for some people that's actually easier when you don't have to critically think and try to find better ways. But once I read Drive by
Mm.
was that was that Pink, Daniel Pink?
Yes, Dan Pink.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, autonomy, mastery, and purpose.
Hmm.
And if people have autonomy, mastery, and purpose, that is the motivation that you want to capture, and try not to get in the way of that. And so many of these processes inflicted on people take away some of their purpose, their autonomy, or even their ability to master what they're doing. So
Exactly.
when you see that filter, a lot of the a lot of the problems start to become quite apparent why things aren't working well.
Right. And autonomy can have some guardrails around it too. It doesn't necessarily have to be a free for all. If your entire system, existing system, is written in Java and using Spring Boot or something like that, it doesn't mean that yeah, we don't want to do that. We're going to do Node and React for this next part. You want a little bit of guardrails. It might make perfect sense to do that, and in which case it's okay, but you still have to have some discussions around what are the boundaries of the of autonomy. Quite often they should be bigger or wider than they are, but they're not boundless. Let's put it that way.
We had one developer who is a little bit newer, and as they were going through the code base, they in our pipeline, they saw so many things that they didn't like, and they wanted to dive in and fix everything. So I actually asked the person, just make a list of make a list of all the junk that you see, and when you get to 25, let me know. And then when they got to 25 things that they wanted to fix, then we tried to prioritize it to say, okay, which one is really the top one? And you're never going to have everything perfect, but at least they were able to stay a little bit more focused and not go down rabbit holes in every area.
Cool. Anybody else with anything that has worked well? Or the second point here, what have you done before that you've now left behind? That after whether it's something that was prescribed from a process or you experimented with before and realized, no, it's not really that effective, and you've left it behind now. Anybody out there?
One thing that we've kind of left behind as a team is pointing stories.
Ah, yes. And why'd you leave it behind? I'm curious.
We weren't getting any value out of it. It felt arbitrary, and you can find value, but it wasn't the value we were after. So it didn't mean anything to us at a certain point.
Right. I've written a whole series of blog posts on that, on stories, on the history, how we use them, because I used story points in the aughts, up to around 2011 or so. And yeah, you realize when you start to look at it that counting stories is equally effective in terms of identifying we've always done it this way, exactly. And that's we've always done it this way is actually that's something I should have included in this, is a way, how do you get past that, but I haven't, unfortunately. But counting stories is just as effective. Slice them as small as you can, and interestingly, the data that I had from multiple Jira encounters was suggested that even teams that weren't that great at splitting stories, it's still tracking stories completed by count is just the same as tracking by points completed. One of the ways people push back is, well, we have conversations. We have to have conversations about what goes into the thing. Well, you can have what goes into something that makes it 13 points versus 8. You can still have those conversations. We do, the groups I work with, and it's just as effective. Just learn how to split stories small, which a lot of people have not done yet, and that's a big deal. We can get better at it. How have things changed for you since you? I'm curious. This is the We Write Code folks. How have things changed for you since you did that?
Well, there's just less ceremony and process around getting started on work.
Nice.
But I would agree that, like, when we've needed some sort of metric, we've actually counted stories. We've looked at historical projects, counted how many stories do we get done in 6 months? How many stories do we get done? Because our stories are generally, they average out to about the same size, no matter what they're describing. I think as a result of us being pretty consistent with how we break down stories, that's allowed us to say, we can just look historically and say, we get this many stories done, in this amount of time. And that's a reasonable, velocity if we need to predict out to the future. But
Right.
yeah.
I would absolutely agree. And you can use things like Monte Carlo, Monte Carlo forecasting, yesterday's weather, that sort of thing, that is just as effective. I'm probably more so, because it's not going to take hope into the equation. I'm just pasting in. There's the first in a series of 5 blog posts that I wrote recently about exactly this this topic. But thank you. That's great.
Hey Dave, this
All right.
is Adam. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah. Yes.
So I have a question for you. I think I agree with most everything that you presented here. I think it makes a lot of sense. I will say, as a leader so I work in the insurance organization or in the insurance sector. We are not an industry that lives and dies by IT effectiveness. Meaning, if you look at the sales and the bottom line performance of insurance companies, the quality of their IT department, their effectiveness of their IT department doesn't necessarily drive who leads in those spaces. There's reputational risk, there's distribution partners, there's much more complexity to it. So it becomes a little bit easy or a little more challenging at times to say the way we're approaching IT, we should rethink this. We should model this differently. We should be working differently. We should take risks in these ways. Whereas I think in some of the tactical examples you provided, those are businesses and companies that they truly live and die by their IT effectiveness. So it becomes an easier sale to potentially go, we should really rethink this from the ground up because we will thrive as a business if we make this type of shift. How have you seen it maybe in some more established sectors, or where have you kind of seen that play out where I'm just curious how it would apply in some more established industries.
As I make my green screen go, in the banking industry, they are jumping all over this. Some more than others. RBC, for instance, I know groups there that went from a release a year to continuous delivery, and they are now seeing it as for them it's a competitive advantage. Now, I would challenge the assertion that IT or systems are not necessarily part of the core way of doing things or part of the core business in insurance. My dad was in the insurance business for almost 50 years. He actually originally suggested I get into actuarial science, and I said, "No, Dad, no." But the IT now, and I look at the groups that are sorry, just personally what I work with between banking and insurance. I'm looking for the online stuff. One of the bank or my primary bank that I work with, when I go into the banking app, there's a mix of 2 different user interfaces. They're in the process of migrating over to a newer one. But they're doing it incrementally as opposed to a big bang, which is full of risk. Now, when you are doing these things, especially when you're doing experiments, you are going to identify you should identify what is the risk associated with this. If we screw this up, is this going to lose business? Or is it going to mess with data that could affect us monetarily? And it doesn't matter whether you are a 10-person startup or a 150-year-old insurance company. You should be asking those questions. I'm all in favor of identifying and discussing risk associated with something. And it's funny, when I talked about Shopify, which is a standard scrappy startup, I was the one there who was saying, okay, if we screw up, every minute that Shopify is unavailable to the merchants costs them $45,000 in revenue every minute. And we were able to quantify that from the data so that we could say we need to make sure we're automating things. We need to improve testing. We need to do these things. And this was when it was still a startup. And part of my role there was as they were growing, I needed to. I made it a point to introduce a lot of these things. So it's keep risk right there in front of you. Make sure that you identify what the risks are. Talk about those as part of the experiments. Now, when we talk about experiments, you're not just throwing shit at a wall and seeing if it sticks. It's you want to be, if you were in chemistry, and I remember vividly in organic chemistry class in university, where you're mixing a couple of things together. You need to do so carefully under a fume hood with gloves on, and so you've already identified and are addressing risks with that. So again, with it from the experimental point of view, it just doesn't mean just do anything. It does mean that you have to look at that. Does that answer your question, Adam?
Yeah, I think a flavor of it. It wasn't really meant to say we shouldn't still pursue effectiveness. It's more the companies that do have very lean, high performing IT groups. What they see is there will come a time in which that does matter. The quarter to quarter results, year to year results, it's more difficult to demonstrate. And so if we wanted to go to our executive team and say, we would like to think about the way that we run our teams differently, the way we have our internal audit and controls processes set up. We would like to think about the way that we fund and the way projects are facilitated. It would just be no. That's not really what we're interested in doing, because how do we very clearly then say, in 2024, 2025, here's what you can expect from your IT group. And if we can't answer that very clearly, that's why a lot of these processes and things exist, is to, they're looking at it almost as a way to say, hey, we are abstracted from most of what's going on. How do we get an understanding and appreciation for what people are working on? And how do we assure that there's accountabilities in place to make sure those things are being delivered? And if they're not being delivered, we understand where they stand.
Right. And I think it's kind of outside the scope of what we're talking here. And I do need to get through a couple more slides and looking at time. But things like pivoting from project focus to product focus does make a difference. I just finished up a gig with Starbucks where they had done that. And they, within a couple of months, the consumers of the work were thrilled with the idea. And this was, they were actually, Starbucks, you'd think of them as they're out there. No, they're not. They're actually pretty tied down. And you are talking about risk of, if we introduce something that borks the point of sale, we're in deep trouble. And their internal processes were such that getting a one-line update out to fix something would take probably a week. So they'd have to live with that for a week. So things were pretty locked down. But even there, moving away from everybody competing to get their projects through, and potentially under scoping or underestimating deliberately how big a project was just to get it approved, because that happens. That went away. Now the teams were funded for an entire year. And what does the team cost? There's your budget plus whatever you need for capital and any associated costs. But then the work went back to the product managers who to figure out what's the most important stuff that we have to deliver. And while I was there, it came to they were going to probably miss quarterly numbers. So it came down from the CEO, change your priorities to push things that will increase revenue higher up. And so that, threw a wrench in the works, as they say. And so the product managers had to do that. But rather than having to cancel projects because the teams were working in a product mode, it was, okay, we just rejig the backlog. And what we're pulling next is different than what we thought it was going to be. So that's a potential way of looking at it there. I'm going to move on here very quickly. Now, let's go all Darwinian here, and it's not the strongest. It's the ones that are most adaptable and adjust to the changing environment that survive. Once again, universal law is for lackeys, context is for kings, and everybody's context is different, even from team to team potentially, but certainly from organization to organization. And yeah, Adam, you're in a very specific context there. Some people here might be in a regulatory situation where they have specific things they have to hit. Others might be small startups that it doesn't matter. You're just trying to get something out and survive long enough to get customers. Those are all different contexts. And finally, there's me, circa 1970. And I'm not quite that skinny now. Let's put it that way. And as you can see, my hair is a different color. But this is where you can reach me if you have any questions whatsoever. Please reach out and connect with me on LinkedIn. I'm on Twitter, Mastodon. I'm actually on Blue Sky and Threads as well, but not as much as Twitter and Mastodon. And thank you very much for having me. If you have time for questions, or I know that's you had some things to go through.
Yeah, and I think Dave and I actually probably know each other the best, even though we worked at Industrial Logic together. I think it's the Twitter where we've kind of gotten to know each other most, and just interacting on there. So I would definitely agree that those channels are best to chat with Dave more. So Dave, thank you so much for coming out here and working with us to get a good time. Fabulous content. I was messaging somebody during this, recognizing that I think if you really pay attention to how teams work, you really do start kind of coming to these conclusions as well. Much as the theory is beautiful, a lot of people have kind of come to the same conclusion, even though we didn't actually have the exact same journey.
Yeah.
So thank you so much for coming here. I'm going to go ahead and thank our sponsor, Robert Half, as well. And I'll be wrapping up the recording here. We will put this out on YouTube, and we'll share it via Twitter and LinkedIn.